Hello there, my name is Eris. I design book covers mostly for the romance and erotic romance genre, and today I'm going to talk about methods I use to get a nice clean selection in Photoshop of stock photography models, the people that are going on the cover of our book. I have a live cover I'm working on for a client right now, and I'm going to use this man here as an example of how to get a nice clean selection. Now this stock image of this man, he's standing there wherever they've taken this photograph. He's got a black background around him. The point of this is we don't want to see the black background. I'm going to hide him for a second. What we want to see is him standing in front of this other kind of distressed looking background instead, with none of the interfering black. I should back up and say that me going through this process is going to assume that you have at least some intermediate knowledge of Photoshop. I'm working with Creative Cloud, so I have whatever the most current version is as of March 2018. I'll try to explain everything, but the super basic stuff I probably will be skipping. So let's get down to selecting this guy. Now there's a lot of selection tools you can work with. I'm just going to show you the ways I go about it. If you just grab, one of the easiest and my favorite go-to selection tool is the quick selection tool, which is, you may have your toolbar on the left arranged however you want it, but it's usually by default somewhere near the top. It looks like a little paintbrush with a little dotted selection lasso behind it. If you hover over it, it'll say quick selection tool. If it's not on the top, it's in the same tool as the magic wand, which you may have that on top, and you may need to switch what that tool is to the quick selection tool instead. The keyboard shortcut for the quick selection tool is W, for those of you who are people who like to use the keyboard, which I do sometimes, but I can't remember all the shortcuts. I just don't have that good of a memory. So the quick selection tool comes up like a little paintbrush, and basically at this point you can, quote, paint your selection, and Photoshop with its intelligence figures out where areas are that you'd want to select. Now, we could just go ahead. This gentleman here has some very clear edges to parts of him, where, the left side where his arm is, and light is shining on his arm. So we could go ahead and start selecting this, and Photoshop is pretty good about figuring what to select. Okay, that's great. That's all well and good. We can start selecting him. However, I'm going to zoom in here. When we come over here to this side of him, or the top of him, you can see that things are not as clear. As you can see, as I try to paint the selection up the back side of his hair, once I start getting to the top of his hair, and the hair is getting darker, and it's almost as black as the surrounding background information, the selection tool freaks out and goes, oh, you mean you want to select all of this black, and then suddenly you lose your selection of the guy. You see the dotted line, the marching ants as they call it, have disappeared, because now they're on the complete outside of the entire image. So I'm going to undo, and now I'm back here. But again, if I keep trying to paint in his head, the pixels are too similar in tone and darkness and color, so it selects everything, and you don't want it to. And then, in addition to that, there are other tricky areas like hair, where if you select a hard edge for all of this hair, which we know hair is made up out of all kinds of little tiny fibrous bits, it's going to look horrible. Nobody has just a solid shellacked lump of hard hair. If we were to select that and delete his background, it would look very unnatural. However, painting in hair by hand for your selection is also a nightmare, and something that you probably don't want to spend a lot of time on, especially if you're doing this professionally, and it's not your own cover. It's, not quite so much a labor of love, but more I need to get this done because I have other clients, so who wants to paint in hair? So we're gonna see that this tool here this selection tool is lacking for these reasons. Now look, see, I zoom out, it's selected the whole entire guy once again, the whole entire image, not just the parts I want. So while the quick selection tool works well when you have nice sharp defined edges, when you start to get into places where it's not so defined, black next to very dark brown, or this kind of nebulous hair area, suddenly you start to have problems with your selection. Yeah, it's really fighting me. So rather than, now there's a whole bunch of other, again, there's a million ways to select stuff in Photoshop, and I'm not going to go over every single one of them. What I'm going to do is just take you through the things I am using to accomplish the goal of getting a nice selection on this model and getting rid of, or hide, we're going to hide his background. I don't like to delete anything. I like to use non-destructive editing methods wherever possible in case I have to realize that I've made a mistake in what I'm doing and I need to go back and get that background again. So I'm not going to delete it, I'm just going to hide and mask it off. But either way, we need to get a selection for this guy. So I'm going to deselect, which you can come up to the select menu and click on deselect. Once in a while on here you may also see me a little tiny pop-up menu like this, and that is because I am using a Wacom tablet, which is a pressure-sensitive drawing tablet. So if you see this little menu pop up, just ignore what I'm doing, because if you're not using a tablet, it may be irrelevant to you. Also, I've programmed what things are on this menu for my own purposes as well. So the first, there's a couple of different steps in the process I do to get a good selection on a person. Really anything. It doesn't just have to be a person, but because the nature of romance novel covers almost always have people on them, so this is a common problem that people that are designing romance novel book covers have to deal with. So, one of the first places I go is the channels panel, which I'm hovering my mouse over here on the right. The channel, if it should be on there in the default bunch of panels, but if it is not, if you come up to window menu at the top, and then you go down and you will see excuse me, I don't know my alphabet, you will see channels near the top. If you click on channels, it'll open up the channels panel for you. If it wasn't docked here on this little bar of panels at the side, it may be a floating window and then a little floating tab, and you can attach it to the bar if you want, or just leave it floating, whatever. But I have channels by default over here. So channels, and if you're looking for the icon, it basically looks like three little differently toned circles all kind of merged together in like a triple Venn diagram looking thing. If you expand, it'll name it channels, but I like to keep my panel as small as possible. So by default, when you're looking at your whole image, you will see that 4 channels are highlighted. This image I'm working with is in RGB color mode right now. I'm not working in CMYK. I would not do that until I went to go flatten everything and send the author a print cover, but we're working in RGB, so you're going to have 4 channels highlighted. One channel is, the top one is the RGB channel, that is all of your image data. It's all of the colors, and then the underlying red, green, and blue channels that make that up. So if I just click on, for example, the red channel, I'm only seeing the red information, the lights and darks based on how much red is in this image. If I only click on the green channel, I'm only seeing the lights and darks based on the colors in this image that are green and blue and so forth. When you click on RGB, it highlights all of them and combines them, and you get your full color image. Now you'll see in my channels panel I've got some extra extraneous stuff because this cover I'm working on I've already been working on for a while, and so I've got a ton of layers going. But right now what I'm going to do, so what had happened is I made a mock-up of this cover for the author. The author approved it, so now I'm going in with the final high-res images, and because I'm substituting those in there, I have to remake the selections because the low-res images had horrible, ugly selection edges. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at each red, green, and blue channel of this image, and I'm going to pick the one that gives me the most contrast between the thing I'm trying to select, which in this case is this guy, and the background I am trying to hide or remove. So I'm looking at the red channel. As you can see, he already had really good contrast between his left arm and the background. If I switch back to RGB and then look at the red channel by itself right after, I can see that I'm getting a little more contrast up here at the top of his head, and definitely more in the hair and this other arm. I'm going to try out the other channels and see what they look like, so I'm going to click on green. Now green gives me a little less contrast on top of his head, but a little more on this pant leg down here on the right. And then the blue channel switching back and forth between green and blue. The blue gives me the most contrast between his pants in the background. However, we're losing contrast between the top of his head and his hair. So sometimes you have to pick the lesser of three evils in this situation. You have to decide what is going to be the most difficult for you to select and go with the channel that has the most contrast in the place that's going to be the biggest problem for you. I'm thinking I like the red channel the best. I think that's giving me the most contrast in his hair, which is going to be problematic. His jeans, it's not so great. However, that's a pretty easy line to deal with. And also, I am aware ahead of time in this cover design, not that much focus is being placed on his pants. It's almost hidden, so I'm not that concerned that that selection edge is going to be great and perfect. So now that I have I've chosen the red channel for my selection, but we're not done yet because we're going to make this even easier for our selection tool to pick out different parts of this image. So I'm going to click on the red channel. It's already selected. I'm going to click on it, and basically I'm going to drag. You're grabbing it. You'll see the little hand icon there. It makes a grabbing fist. And I'm going to pull it all the way down to the bottom of the channels panel where there is the little new channel button, because if you grab a channel and drag it onto the new button, which looks like a little post-it with a folded corner, what it does is it duplicates that channel. So now at the bottom I have red copy 2, red channel copy 2. The reason you want to make a copy is because I'm about to start messing with the light and dark levels of the red channel. And you don't want to do it on the original red channel because that's the one that's comprising your actual whole image. So you'd basically be making a bunch of wacky color and tone changes to your whole image. You don't want to do that. You just want to do it on a copy. All we need is a copy to get our selection, because the selection can then be moved to any channel we want. So let's do our destructive stuff we're about to do on this copy of the red or whatever channel you're using. Very important to make a copy. Sometimes you're going to forget, and then you're going to go back to your main image and be like, what have I done? Because it's going to be crazy. But fortunately, that is what the undo and the history panel is for, to go back and fix, silly stuff like that we all do. So now that I've got my red copy 2 channel, what I'm going to do is make a levels adjustment. Now you can hit Control L and it will pop up the levels adjustment window, or you can go to the image menu and go to adjustments, and there'll be a little pop out, and then you can go to levels, which is right at the top. Click on levels. Okay, so now you've got your little levels window. I'm going to bring that over here. Now, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this image as high contrast as possible where the edges of this guy are. I'm an author, I can't make words go. Now, normally what I would do is I would start with in the levels window, you've got your little graphical input of the tonal levels here. As this is a very dark image, you can see that there's high amounts of information over on the dark half where you can see the little black slider underneath. And there's not a lot of graphical information near the light half where there's a little white slider. If you grab these sliders, you'll see, look, the image is getting very dark. If I grab the black slider, if I grab the white slider and move it in, things are getting very light. Now, normally what I do, the first thing I do is I grab the black end slider and I start moving it up until I get the darkest parts of the image as dark as I can get them without losing the edges of the guy. Now, this is already really dark, so I'm guessing we're not going to move the dark slider at all in this case. But see what happens? Move the dark slider, he's getting very dark. But I don't have any leeway. Like, I'm already looking down here at the edge of his pants and seeing that it's already very close to the background around it, and as soon as I start pulling that slider, I'm losing where his pants are. So I'm just, in this particular case, I'm going to leave the black end slider alone. Now, image with more mid-tones, you probably are going to move that black slider up. If we weren't concerned with his pants at all and maybe just his forearm area, there would be some room to see. Now the background is very black, but there's good definition on the edges of his arms, and that would be good. But again, we need this image to not get any darker. So the next thing I do is I grab the white slider at the opposite end here, and I start pulling it in. And you can usually see graphically where you're going to run out of room to pull it. Like, there's no white information until we get to about here. So I can probably pretty safely pull it into there and not get any areas that start getting blown out. I'm looking at him, still it looks okay. I'm going to drag this white slider as far as I can until I start losing data. And when I say losing data, see, look, I've dragged it all the way over, and now it's just an enormous big white blob. So I'm going to grab it to about here. Now, I could leave it here, but I am seeing that on his arm, where it looks like there's some peach fuzz arm hair, the edge is getting really ragged, and that's not probably what I want to go with for this guy. So I'm not going to drag it over quite. I mean, we've still got plenty of definition on this dude here. So you're just going to play with the slider until you get some nice contrast between all the things you want to select and the background. I'm going to be about... God. Sometimes, and there's a lot of fussing too. There's a lot of swearing and flailing until you get it where you want, which is okay. We're artists, that's our job. This is okay. I don't want to do it too much because it's getting, again, the edge is getting a little ragged with how much, you know, he's got some body hair, which is it's very manly. And the middle slider is the gray slider, so sometimes usually you don't even have to mess with it, but sometimes you can poke around and see if you need to, but I'm going to leave it where it is. Now, this is doing a little better for us. You can see at the top of his head, there is more difference between the top of his head and the background of the image than there was with the plain old RGB channel in which we started. I like how I've done this adjustment here, so I'm going to hit OK. So now our red copy 2 channel is been adjusted. Oh! Had to get the cat off the desk. She's decided she needs to be part of this. Okay. Now, just as an example, when I click back to the full RGB channel, here's our guy, and you can see, you can barely tell the top of his head from the background. But when I click on red copy 2, the one we've adjusted, now you can see some difference. This is much easier and more contrast between him and the background for us to make our selection. So I'm going to go back to the quick selection tool, which is the kind of paint in a selection. It's still not going to be perfect, but this is the big chunk of step 1 of doing this. So I'm going to now go in and start selecting. And this tool can be adjusted, the brush size, like a paintbrush. You can make it big, you can make it small. I've made it about where I mean, you just have to play around if you've not used it before. I've made it where I like to have it for this size of a person. I may need to make it smaller if I need to zoom in and get fussy with details. I'm not going to get too fussy, and we'll look at that in the next. But see how now it has selected the top of his head and did not get crazy and try to select a bunch of the background. So we're doing much better now. We've cured some of our ills. Oop, see, now I tried to select his butt area, and there's not quite enough contrast. It's trying to select this black section between his rear end and his hand, so we'll come back to that. Anything that makes it select everything when you don't want it to, you may just have to leave that alone for a little bit and come back. Same problem when I'm trying to select his jeans on this side. It just is trying to select everything. There's a couple other ways I can go about this. I can zoom in and see if I get closer with the selection tool, maybe make the brush a little smaller if it... Nope, it does not want to recognize. So again, I'm going to bust out a tool I don't use much, but I think it'll work in this case for us, which is right above the quick selection tool. There's the various lasso tools. There's the regular lasso where you can just draw whatever freeform shape. There's the polygonal lasso, which you can make any sort of straight-sided polygon type closed shape. And then there's the magnetic lasso, which is what I'm going to use. I'm going to click on that. And the magnetic lasso will attempt to follow the edges. It tries to be smart and tries to follow the edges of what you're trying to select. So now let's make sure that we're doing this properly. I've got a selection going, and I want to keep adding more stuff. So I want to make sure up here on the top menu bar that I've got the Add to Selection option clicked for this tool. It was on Subtract From, and that would make problems for me, but I want to add. I definitely don't want it to be on New Selection, because then I lose all of his arms and head and torso that I've already done. So Add to, and you can tell you're on Add to Selection, because on the cursor there's a little plus next to your cursor. Okay, so I'm going to click on where we left off here on his jeans, and I'm going to just kind of, I'm not clicking while I'm doing this. I'm hovering, in my case it's a pen, but I'm hovering the mouse above where I want to go, and you could go faster than this, but I'm talking and being slow. And it basically tries to be smart and find the edges of what you're selecting. Now, if it thinks it finds a sharper edge, sometimes it jumps to that. So you can see it's trying to jump to this pocket instead of the edge of his pants. So So if you hit delete, it'll delete any little anchor points that the selection tool makes. You can see it's making little square anchors along the way. In order to manually make anchors and force it not to jump to something you don't want it to, you can click down and make an anchor. So I'm clicking, 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 clicking. Now we're safely past that high contrast pocket area, and I've followed down the edge of his pants until we get to where the pants fade into black. Again, I'm not being perfect on this. Ooh, what did I do? What have I done? Okay. I clicked somewhere wrong and closed off the selection when I shouldn't have. Let's try this again, people. It's time from the top. Okay. So I'm just going to drag now there's nothing to select down here where his pants fade off into nothing, so I'm just ignoring that for now, and I've gone over to the other side. Again, I'm just hovering and sliding the cursor above, and it is making its own judgments about where this selection should be. Now this usually makes, I gotta say, pretty crummy selections, but it's enough to get you an area more or less selected, and you can go and fine-tune it later. So I'm just going up, and I'm not even trying, but I'm just kind of looping in everything that we were missing, and then I gotta find the last little endpoint so I can close it off, and then click, and now I have selected his whole pants area, and again, we can come back later and refine that, since it's not that great right now. I have also quickly gone back to my I forget the names of things. I just know the icon and I look at it. I've gone back to my quick selection tool, the one where you paint, and I'm just eyeballing a couple areas, like here on his wrist, where I could probably do a little better of a job. I'm not going to beat myself up about the edges of his hair right now, because there's going to be a way that we're going to do a better job of that. Okay, so going to go back to zoom out here. So here's our guy. We've got a pretty good selection, much better than we would have had if we would have tried to just work off the RGB layer. But now I am in fact going to go back to the RGB layer. Now we're selected. Now there's a couple ways you could go about this. I want to go just to one quick round of refinement with the quick mask tool before I head into the last of our selection tools, which is going to be the select and mask feature, which is new-ish to Creative Cloud. And it is a great feature, although it is also a RAM hog, which we'll talk about that in a minute. So if you just press Q on your keyboard, you will be in the quick mask mode. So what this is everything that it is showing of the guy, that's where you have selected, and everything that is a translucent background color. Now by default it's red, so when you do this and you see red, don't panic. You can change it to any color you want, and I personally think, I just like the mint green. It's less hard on the eyes. And also it's an uncommon background color, so I find that it interferes less than red. If you want to change the color of the quick mask, you can come over here underneath the foreground and background color. I think it's in here. I hope I'm not wrong. And then I think if you double-click on the quick mask underneath, yes, you'll get quick mask options, and you can pick what color. You can click and it'll give you a color picker, and you can pick whatever color you want, and then you can make the opacity whatever you want. So I have this mint green at 30%. Again, let me hit Q, and now I'm in quick mask mode. So now basically you've got masked and not masked, and now you can use any sort of paint tool you want. Any sort of paintbrush, any crazy pattern of paintbrush. You can blur the edges, whatever you want to do, and basically wherever you paint, that's going to be selected, and wherever is wherever is unpainted is going to be selected, and wherever you paint over is going to be not selected. Again, I'm not going to fuss with his hair, because that is a job for the next tool, and there's really not much to do, but I'm going to do just a little bit just to give an example. So I've clicked on my brush tool. I am going to go over to my brush panel and pick out a soft, round, pressure-sized brush. Hopefully it will change over and recognize my... You better recognize... There it goes. It's recognizing the pressure-sensitive tablet, and you can see that the ends of the brush sample get very tiny, and that is because if I push on it less, it gets smaller. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in, and any just real obvious stuff where it either should have or should not have selected, I am going to go ahead and paint in. So if you paint white, you're going to be painting an area that is selected. If you paint black, you'll notice black and white are your options in this mode. If you paint black, you're going to be painting what's not selected. So I'm painting in around his eye here that didn't get, I mean, it's, there's little things. We did a pretty good job here with, so now you can see, we did a pretty good job with selecting this guy using the RGB channel and levels adjustment. Now you can see, zoom in because it's a tiny YouTube video, you can see that at the edge of his arm there's some weirdness. It didn't select very well. So again, I'm just going to paint that in with my paintbrush tool. It doesn't have to be too perfect because we're going to do some refining in our next step. But I'm just seeing like his arm is kind of messy, but I think his hand, this is kind of a ragged edge. Now, before the next tool that we're going to use, I admit that I would be using the quick mask to really go in and refine everything. So I would be spending a whole lot more time than I am now doing what I'm doing now, because I would be making every little edge perfect. It does not have to be too perfect here, but anything that's large, I might as well just take care of. So again, I'm just going in and painting in places that it should have been selected and it didn't get. And if there's any real large places where it should not have been selected, I would paint black. For example, up here where his arm meets his body, there's a little black wedge. Just paint that in. Okay. Alright, again, we'll be working with the hair later, also learning how to speak English. This isn't bad. One thing I'm also going to do, just because I know I need information here in my the whole composition of the cover, not just this guy I'm selecting now, is I'm going to paint in where the rest of his pant legs ought to be, at least down to the bottom of his image. It doesn't have to be perfect because, again, as I mentioned, this whole cover composition, some of this guy is hidden, some of it's very dark, I'm not totally sure, but I'm just going to give myself some extra little bits of information for his pants right now. Just cleaning it up a little bit. Doesn't have to be perfect. If I could see his pants, I'd spend more time making it perfect, but since it's black, I'm just kind of giving myself a black area to work with. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to fit this entire cover into the window so you can see. This guy is actually only taking up a small portion of the upper right hand of the front cover of a paperback. So I'm just giving you an idea of what I'm working with, but I'm going to zoom back in to our guy in question. So now that I'm done working in, oops, I think I see, no, I'm sorry. Now that I'm done working in quick mask mode, I'm going to hit Q again to exit the mode. And when I do that, we're back at our selection. You can see that the selection has been modified to where I've painted it. So now it's including his pants and all those other minor changes that I made that at this zoom level are hard to see. Now we're going to do the last of the process, provided we get it refined how we want, which is the select and mask. I don't know if I would call it a tool, but we'll go with that. In order to access the select and mask tool, you have to be currently have one of the selection other tools in use. So either one of the marquee tools like the rectangle or ellipse, one of the lasso type tools, or one of the quick selection or magic wand tools. So I'm just going to click on the quick selection tool again, and now you'll notice that in addition to the quick selection tool options up here in the top menu bar, there is also this button that says select and mask and has the ellipsis after it, indicating that when you click on it, it'll open another window. Now, what I would suggest everybody do at this point, especially if your computer is not like new and firing on all cylinders, if you have RAM needs that are not great and you have trouble handling Photoshop, save your document now. So that's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to save. Give it a second. Yes, okay. Because this tool, Photoshop has made improvements, but it is a RAM hog, and sometimes, usually the first time you use it, it's fine, but if you use it more than one time while you're working on the same image, and the image is complicated and large and has a bunch of layers, sometimes maybe the second or maybe the third time you try to use the select and mask tool, it will start freezing up on you. And sometimes it freezes up on you enough that you can't even hit escape and get out of it, and you have to close Photoshop. And if you have not saved, you can know the agony of having to do that and lose a whole lot of work you did. So, save your document, always, then click Select and Mask. Okay. So now you're in, now I happen at the moment to be in something that looks very much like the Quick Mask editing mode. However, in the Select and Mask tool, you have a whole bunch of options for how you'd like to view. So, one of them is Overlay, and that's the one I have on it now, and it looks like Quick Mask. It uses whatever color of Quick Mask you have for that. Even right within here, you can adjust that color, and there's an opacity slider that I like it about 30, but I mean, you could make it fully opaque if you wanted, or barely there. Again, I like it about 30. There's a whole bunch of other options. There's Onion Skin that is going to give you kind of a white overlay. Or excuse me, the Onion Skin is going to just make the background more and more transparent. You can tell how often I use it, I barely know what it does. Marching Ants is going to show you the little white dotted selection outline. I personally do not find that to be very precise, and I never use it in this mode. On Black makes the background black at, again, whatever opacity you want. Sometimes on Black is a good option when the background behind, the final background that's going to be behind your model or whatever is black or very dark, because you can get an idea what your selection will look like on dark. Which sometimes you should try out these different modes, because sometimes you'll discover, hey, your selection edge is not as good as you thought it was. You just couldn't tell because it was on light or it was on dark, and it wasn't, letting you see the details you needed to see. So there's on white, gives you a white background instead. Play with them and see which one works best for you. There's black and white, which is fully like white is selected and black is not selected. Sometimes this is good to just check out how ragged are your edges. You can see where his hair is, some of his arm, the edges are pretty ragged. So for now, and we'll play with some other ones in a minute, I'm just going to go back to Overlay as I had it. Now there's a whole bunch of features, and I'm not going to use every single one of them here. You can play with them and see what they do. They're kind of self-explanatory, and sometimes even if you hover over them, they will tell you what they do. The two things I'm going to use here, so all these little sliders refine the selection edge. The software decides based on what parameters, what it should do with the selection edge. So the first one I use, there's a radius slider, and I just make it be, if it's at 0 pixels by default, I just make it be 1 pixel. And basically Photoshop is going to search 1 pixel on either side of the selection you've already made and make decisions about whether or not other pixels around it should be selected. I'm going into a bunch of mumbo jumbo, possibly, that you may not need to know, but I like to know things. Then there's global refinements. Again, I don't really use feather that much. I mean, there's, at least for these purposes, it's useful, it's just not for this, selecting models off a background. So the smooth slider, which smooths jagged edges, where I was talking about his arm and his hair a little bit, I also like to make that be 1 pixel. You might, if your selection is really ragged, you might make it more, but go fuss with it. I'm not going to do feather. Contrast basically makes your selection edge, it's the opposite of feather. It makes it more sharp. I'm not going to use that because I don't need it to be any sharper than it is already. And then shift edge is at 0%. If you drag it to the right, it makes your selection larger, and if you drag it to the left, it's going to contract the selection and make it smaller. There's a whole bunch of output settings, honestly. Just leave it be. You can go fuss with that later, but the defaults are what we're working with. So the only things I've changed here is edge detection, a radius of 1 pixel, and under global refinements, the smooth slider I have made 1 pixel. I may need to adjust, I may not. So this is where we're going to go in and fuss with things like his hair. This is where Photoshop has done a thing that has saved so much time I can't even explain to you. So I'm going to zoom in to 100%. There's a few limited amount of tools on the left here. You got a magnifying glass, you've got a quick selection type tool, you've got a brush tool that you can paint in your selection like we did in quick mask mode right before we got in here. There's some various lasso tools. The first one we're going to work with, though, is the Refine Edge Brush tool, and this is where Photoshop is doing some serious voodoo on your behalf, and you should be thanking it. So again, I'm going to zoom. I usually like to work at about 200%. This is about 250, but it probably is easier for you to see when you're watching this on a small little YouTube screen. So I'm going to click on the Refine Edge Brush tool, which is the one where there's a little paintbrush and then there's a little icon behind it that is not a nice round circle. It's kind of a jagged, feathery looking thing. Now, again, this is something that you can size. There's a little panel that you can size and adjust the hardness of the brush, the roundness of the brush. I just usually leave it round, 100% hardness. I mean, you could reduce the hardness a little, I guess. Doesn't matter. You can size it how you want. I've already got the brush sized about how I always use it in here. Basically, the radius of this brush determines the area that Photoshop is going to look at to see what it should be doing different selection-wise. So Photoshop is going to try to be smart and go, well, most of the background that you have hidden is black or very dark colored, and most of what you've got selected is these other types of colors. So when I run the brush, I'm gonna click and drag the brush over. Right now, the example where his hair starts here, I haven't dragged yet, but when I do that, Photoshop is going to make a determination on what should be selected and what shouldn't be selected based on the work you've already done, and based on these little sliders that we've made here. So I'm going to click and hold down, and it's going to look weird while you're doing it, but just relax. I'm going to go up to about his ear, and I'm dragging it over the edges of his hair, all the little bits of hair that are kind of sticking off, the little flyaways. I'm going to drag it up to about his ear so you can see the difference. I'm still holding down, and now I'm going to let go of the mouse. Okay, so now if you see, I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. The edges of his hair is not just whatever crummy selection we made. Now Photoshop has selected individual hairs. It's deselected areas that it thinks are black and don't belong there. This is a lot of work. This is a lot of stuff you would not want to be doing by hand because it would take forever and be tedious, and you have other things to do because you're a busy person. So this is an awesome thing. It is not perfect. It still is in areas where there's not contrast between two things. It's not great, and then you have to go do some work by hand, but it still saves a lot of time and effort in places where there's a decent amount of contrast. So again, I'm just still going along the other kind of furry edges of the hair here. Alright, so it's selected some more, but I don't know if I like how much extra flyaway hair there is, so I might go back and change it. At the top of his hair, again, it's pretty low contrast, so you'll see that it's going to give me kind of like a, especially on top of his head, kind of a mushy edge. Now, in the case of this particular cover, that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you may not want that depending on your cover design, so there may be some adjustments you have to go back and manually make, which is okay. So I'm going to continue around the edges of his face where there's extraneous little bits of hair and places where there's background that is, amongst the hair, and I'm going to continue to kind of draw my edge refinement brush over all this hair. Brush, 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 brush. Oh my gosh, I'm a dork. Okay. Continuing to keep going. We've done it over the bulk of the hair. I could enlarge my brush and kind of include some of this other sections of flyaway hair. I don't know how crazy I want to get with it. That's okay. I'm okay with this. I don't want it, because sometimes it starts, you'll see, you'll play with it and you'll see. Sometimes it starts getting crazy and you're like, I don't need all of that selected. So I usually go around the whole image and see if there's any place where this refinement brush could work for me. Sometimes, like the edge of his arm, it was getting a little fuzzy here. See, those refinement sliders have already worked out on his hand. Remember before where it was a very ragged edge? It's already kind of calmed that down. I don't think I need to adjust that anymore. So I'm just going to leave it. And I could fuss over his body hair over here, but I'm really not going to. I don't know if we need to see every hair on this dude. Now so see where his back here, it seems like there's some stuff that's deselected, that's green, that ought to be selected. Now I can use this refinement brush, but I think it's doing the opposite of what I want. I mean, it's a machine, it's only as smart as what it's programmed to do. You are a human being with eyeballs, and you can see that you need things selected here that aren't. So I'm going to switch to just the regular brush tool, which I have on a very low amount of hardness. I don't know why. I'm going to put it up to like 89%. The regular brush tool, if it's on plus, you're going to be adding things to the selection. Be the equivalent of painting white on your clip. I'm just going in and selecting his back here. I don't know why I was hiding that part. And anything else, I think. Now, there was, like I mentioned above, there were some areas where it got a little wonky at the top of his head because the contrast was very low. So I'm just going to go in and manually paint that stuff in. Maybe here next to his eye where there's probably hair. Just the lighting is dark. There's not a whole lot else. A couple places on his pants. I mean, I'm being very nitpicky, but that's how I am. And then there was a little bit down here at the bottom that I can see is green. I don't want that. Okay. But as you're seeing, Photoshop is doing a lot of work for you, especially with that Refine Edge brush tool and things like hair. It also comes in handy with things like, I don't know, like lace, like if you're doing a historical novel and there's a female character and she's got a lacy outfit on and there's, you know, just really edges that are complicated or nebulous, things like that. It's very helpful to select, or blurry edges of things, also helpful for selecting. So I think I'm pretty happy with this guy. I can always, the thing about what I'm about to do is I'm going to hide the background on this man and not delete the background. So if I decide I don't like this selection or there's parts of it that need modifying, I can go modify them and I don't have to panic that I've deleted stuff and oh no, oh no. So here's our dude. Huh? Anyway, so I feel confident with this selection. So once I'm done and I feel good about my selection with this guy, in the lower right corner of this Select and Mask tool, I'm going to click OK. Now, if you click OK and it takes a minute and it isn't doing anything, just stop touching anything and just let Photoshop do what it does, because this is part of the RAM hog thing I was telling you. Sometimes when you click OK, it takes a minute. So just chill and let it do. If you start clicking other stuff, you may freak it out and it may crash the program. Again, just depends on your machine, how old is your computer, what's the state of your RAM. If you're running a bunch of other software at one time and your machine can't handle it, shut that software down and let Photoshop have all the RAM it needs, because it can be a RAM hog, especially with that feature. Okay, so just going to zoom back out. So here's our guy. We've got our selection that we're happy with, and now we want to just use this selection to see only the guy and not the background. Now I had a layer mask on this guy to begin with, but it is from the old low-res sample image from this stock photo website, and I don't want that layer mask anymore. So I'm going to come over here to my layers panel where that is, and I'm just going to delete that. Not relevant to this tutorial. So I've clicked on the layer of the guy. Now what I'm going to go do is at the bottom of the layers panel, there's this little rectangular icon with a circle cut out of it. That is the Add Layer Mask button. I'm going to click that. And now it automatically masks off this layer of this dude where our selection was. And now here's our guy that's been selected from the background. Let's zoom in. Like, look at his hair. So now you can see little strands of his hair, very nicely selected. You can see right through to the background. Now there's a lot of other work that I'm going to do on this person to integrate him into the background, but you can see the top edges of his head, the back of his hair. It's very nicely selected. It's a sharp selection where things are sharp. It's a fuzzy selection where things are blurrier. We've done a good job here, and now we've got ourselves a model who is neatly selected. I can't stress enough the importance. For me, that's one of the key important things about making a cover image look nice, where you're compositing people into backgrounds that's not the background they already came in. Sloppy selection edges, things that are sharp when they shouldn't be sharp, things that are jagged, edges where the artist didn't do a good job cleaning up where there's light or dark at an edge where there shouldn't be. It just makes the cover look sloppy and unprofessional, and your client doesn't want that. You don't want that for your own reputation. And, for pride of work, you would like to put out something that looked good. So, I hope this was helpful information of how to select a model, and I'm hoping to put out some other types of videos like this in the future. So, thanks for watching, and enjoy your Photoshop time.